one of the doctors commenting on the Nuremberg trials, I think it was Leo Alexander, basically said something along the lines of, it was this infinitely small lever, the idea that you can take a human life. Once you cross that Rubicon, there is no going back, and it allows you all sorts of expansion into that thinking. The infinitely small lever is the idea that some lives are not worth living. And once you grant that principle that some lives are not worth living, then everything follows from that, including eugenics, including killing the elderly, killing babies, whatever it might be. And all of it derived from that basic idea that some lives are not worth living.
Using Wi-Fi without NordVPN could mean sharing your private stuff with more people than you think. NordVPN. Online security starts with a click.
When tyranny becomes law, rebellion becomes a duty. So said Thomas Jefferson. Go to bit.ly/lawful tax protest or bit.ly/make-war-history and find out why it is a criminal offence to pay central government or local government taxes in the UK. Britain's Labour government is putting through all sorts of legislation that wasn't part of its agenda, it didn't campaign on, but is going to shape how we live for the rest of our lives. Now, this includes a bill on assisted dying. This is already in place in Canada, it's already in place in Belgium, it's already in place in the Netherlands, and now they want to bring it to the UK. That's what I'm going to be talking about in this video. Hi everybody, it's Crypto Rich, and this is one of my other videos where we're talking about politics and current affairs and all the stuff that's going on. Please follow me on Twitter, CryptoRichYT, join my official Telegram announcements channel, and if you're watching this on YouTube, well, you may not, because I'm so badly censored and shadow banned on YouTube. So support me on ODYSEE, Rumble, and of course, X. Okay, hey, Dr. Callum Miller, thank you so much for making yourself available. Really appreciate this. And you and I, we encountered each other over X because you're opposed to the assisted dying bill. Do you want to start by just saying a little bit about yourself, and then we'll get into the meat of this argument?
Sure. Yeah. Thank you for having me on. So I'm a medical doctor in the UK, and I'm also a researcher at the University of Oxford working on issues to do with bioethics, family policy, and many other things like that. So yeah, this is really an issue that I come at from a medical and a sort of ethical angle. And it's one that obviously only a few countries in the world have gone this far of legalizing, assisted suicide or euthanasia or whatever it might be. And so the UK being on the cusp of that, I've managed to get myself involved without necessarily intending to, but something I felt I should speak out strongly against.
Yes. And I tell you, Callum, it's been like this last few years. All of a sudden, people take, like Jeremy Clarkson with the at the farmers' protest the other day. Who would have thought that, in 100 years that Jeremy Clarkson would be on the streets demonstrating again, in the way that he was. So we find ourselves taking all sorts of positions. Just a little bit about me, because you and I have never spoken before. I'm actually a child protection social worker, and I do this channel on a part-time basis. And when I heard about the assisted dying bill, I was appalled. Now, I'm Muslim, but I'm the kind of Muslim that for 10 years I went to Quaker meetings, because to me there's something about the sanctity of life. And it just doesn't seem right for the government to be initiating this sort of process where people are killed, or I don't know if I'm expressing it the right way. Let's start. And I'm going to try and push back, because I think you and I are of the same view, but I want to give a counter argument as well, for represent those that support this legislation. So just say, what is this assisted dying bill? What does it cover? What's the meat of it?
Yeah, so there's kind of two kinds of euthanasia. Well, there are many other ways to divide it up, but there's kind of euthanasia traditional, which is where there's a doctor or a healthcare professional or whoever else it might be that sort of administers lethal drugs or procedures or whatever to someone, supposedly for their benefit. And then there's assisted suicide, which is sort of a subcategory of that, which is where they don't expect anyone else to actually do it, but they expect people to give the drugs to the patient so that the patient can commit suicide. And so they would call it assisted dying. This is obviously a euphemism. People already die in this country. They're already assisted and cared for when they go through that tragic process. What this is really about is assisted suicide. It's helping people to commit suicide, which, obviously we don't criminalize people who attempt suicide anymore, because we realize they're in a vulnerable place and desperately need help rather than punishment. But we've never allowed people to actually facilitate and help others to commit suicide before. In fact, our country's, everything in our country is shaped totally against it. I've worked in psychiatry, worked as a medical doctor for many years, and even just in general life, we all know that if someone is suicidal, your job is to help them and to prevent them from that.
Right.
None of us think that it's something that we should say, actually, I agree, it's a good idea and we're going to help you do it. And so that's what this bill is fundamentally about. It's saying that certain people, and they've said it's sort of got the strictest safeguards in the world. They said it's certain people with a sort of terminal diagnosis of just 6 months left to live will be eligible for this, and they have to go through a conversation with 2 doctors and so on. So that, supposedly there are safeguards around it, but what we've seen with these kinds of issues, and certainly in other countries on this issue, is that those safeguards are virtually always eroded over time. And so what might look like a relatively restrictive bill to begin with inevitably will become much more lax and much more liberal and extreme over time, as they include more and more categories of people that they want to apply this to.
Right. Now, I believe that's happened in Canada. It's also happened in another nation where they had something similar, and I'll come to that in a bit later on. But what you said at the beginning, so there's euthanasia, and then there's assisted suicide, right? Where, as you described, I've got 6 months left to live according to some diagnosis, and I don't want to carry on like this. Okay, now, when you said the euthanasia, is that something that goes on like as a medical practice? And let me give you a couple of personal examples. So my mother, she was must have been in her mid to late 70s. We found out later she had stomach cancer that had metastasized. She was in really, really poor health, and there wasn't anything that the doctors could do for her at all. And, she was on maximum morphine. We'd go and visit her by the bed, and we knew she was going to go. And what happened was, in the end, the doctor said, look, we don't think there's anything to do. You can come and have her at home. We said, look, we'll have her at home. And in the end, she took her last breaths in my arms. But they didn't do anything to facilitate that process, just to keep her comfortable. And it was a bit, I don't know, like I came into the world into her arms, and she left mine, and I'm glad I got to hold her that way. And then there was my first son, who was born full term, really severe brain damage. We don't know why, couldn't swallow. And his lungs filled up with fluid. And he was in the incubator for about 2 weeks. And the doctor said, well, we can't do anything about him. You can have him home. We don't think he's going to last. We had him for 3 weeks. And eventually his skin turned grey, and he woke up one morning and took his last breath. Now, we were offered an operation for him, and we said no, because they said, look, the operation may not work and it might kill him. And we said, we'll have him as God has given him to us, and we'll love him as long as he's with us. And 20 plus years, I still love him, right? What difference would it make in those situations, this assisted suicide bill? Let's tell it what it is, right? Or state sanctioned murder bill. Does euthanasia go on? What's the current situation?
Yeah, well, thank you for sharing those stories. I think, most of us have situations where we've had loved ones who are dying or who are suffering and in difficult positions. And all of us want to help and be compassionate in that situation. Our job is to love our relatives. As doctors, our job is to care for people and help them get better. And if they can't get better, it's to help ease their symptoms, to make sure that they're comfortable and as much as possible. But the job of a doctor has never been to end a life, to kill a patient. That's sort of fundamentally opposed to medicine. Now, there's a common confusion, which is that, people who oppose doctors killing patients or helping them to kill themselves, there's a common confusion that we are saying that we must always give every treatment to keep someone alive, no matter how invasive, no matter how difficult, and that we have to force treatment on people who refuse it or who are not going to benefit from it or something like that. And that's not the case. So if someone is already dying from a condition, they are allowed to say no to a treatment, and doctors cannot force that treatment on them. And most doctors would not want to force that treatment on them. And so for someone who, is already going to die, they don't want this invasive treatment that probably won't be, very effective. Doctors might recommend a treatment, but the patient doesn't have to say yes, and the doctors can't do anything to force them. And so this isn't about sort of forcing people to go through treatment that they don't want or that it's horrible for them to experience. It's already perfectly legal and standard medical practice for patients to say, I've had enough, I'm not having any more treatment, the treatment is too burdensome or painful, and I don't want to do that. So, withdrawing treatment is not the same as active euthanasia. It's not the same as positively doing something to kill a patient. And so that's the distinction here, is it's already fine to withdraw treatment. If the patient says, I don't want the treatment anymore, doctors can and do withdraw that treatment. But what we're talking about legalizing in this bill is for doctors to be able to give patients fatal drugs in order for the patients to actively commit suicide. And that is a barrier that we have not crossed in this country yet. Occasionally, I hear rumors that, this is already done sort of on the sly or on the down low. It might be the case, but I honestly have never seen it. And believe me, I would be the first person to whistleblow if I had seen doctors breaking the law in that way by killing their patients. I've never seen it, and so I don't think it's a widespread practice, but it might well happen in some cases. It's certainly not legal and certainly not widespread. The only other quick thing I'll add is the other confusion people have is, well, don't we already give painkillers that might shorten the patient's life, like morphine? And isn't that sort of actively killing them? Or isn't that a kind of euthanasia? And the difference again here is that if you give morphine, you do not intend to end the patient's life. Your intention is to ease their pain. And it might be that by giving the morphine, their life does shorten, but that's not what you're intending to do. It's a sort of unintended side effect.
Sure.
Now, in practice, what I've actually heard from palliative physicians is that if you're a good doctor prescribing morphine appropriately, it actually shouldn't even end their life. It's apparently a common misconception that morphine shortens the life. If you give it responsibly, I'm told, it shouldn't actually do that at all. And so even that sort of example is not a very good one. But even supposing that were true, that morphine did shorten the patient's life, the key thing is that this is legal because you're not intending to end the patient's life. You're intending to remove the pain with painkillers, and shortening their life, if it happened, would just be a side effect of that rather than something you actually plan.
Okay, but then what's wrong with ending somebody's life who wants their life ended? They're compos mentis, I suppose. Just end my life, doctor. What's wrong with that?
Yeah. I think there are a number of arguments. So one is a principled argument, and then we can come to the practical arguments later. The principled argument is that there are some rights that are inviolable. So, no one can kill you, no one can put you in slavery, no one can sexually abuse you, no one can do all of these sorts of things that are against fundamental human rights. And when we think about it, many of these human rights actually apply, to ourselves, in the sense that even we are not allowed to violate our own human rights. I'm not allowed to sell myself into slavery. I'm not allowed to traffic myself in human trafficking. I'm not allowed to mutilate my body, and so on. There are many things that we say people cannot do, even to themselves, because it's a fundamental violation of their dignity. Another example, maybe from the sort of left of politics, is with gay conversion therapy. A lot of left-leaning people that support euthanasia, that support autonomy, say there is absolutely no way that someone can legitimately consent to having their sexual orientation changed. It just should not be allowed, even if it's consenting adults. And so I think on both sides of the political spectrum, there's already a recognition that autonomy is not the fundamental value. There are some things that we say are so degrading to human beings that we cannot even do them to ourselves, whether that's selling ourselves into slavery, mutilating our bodies, female genital mutilation, gay conversion therapy, whatever it might be. There are many, many examples. And so that's the kind of principled argument, that fundamentally there are some human rights that are so important and so valuable that we just cannot let anyone violate them, even if they consent to doing it. And that's the sort of principled argument. Then yeah, I'm happy to share some of the practical arguments as well if you'd want to hear them. But
yeah, I do. I absolutely do. So
sure.
And just to come back on what you're saying, people who are suicidal are not well.
Mm.
They're just not well. So how on earth can someone who's suicidal make any sort of fair evaluation on what's best for them?
Right. I think that's right. We know that, this is part of the practical thing, is that many people are coerced into this. They feel like they're a burden. Some people are doing it out of mental illness. In the UK, they're saying, let's not look at Canada, because Canada's just a horrendous example of euthanasia, because it's just out of control and they're killing basically anyone. They're saying, look at Oregon, where it's working well, where the UK proposal is modeled on the state of Oregon in the US. But in Oregon, you look at the statistics, and it's something like 40% of patients undergoing this procedure say that one of the reasons was that they felt like they were a burden to their friends or their family. 8% said that they just were doing it because of the financial implications of being treated. So basically they found it too expensive to actually get treatment, and so they just had the state kill them instead. And relating to your point here, less than 1% of them were evaluated by a psychiatrist, fewer than 1%. Now, if someone is suicidal, the first thing you do is get them a significant evaluation by a healthcare professional. And if they're really seriously suicidal, like they're actually going to do it, you send them to a psychiatrist. That happened in less than 1% of cases in Oregon. And so, these people are not being evaluated properly. They're not being offered the appropriate sort of treatment and care that people in this horrible situation really deserve and should have. And so that's a worry that it will happen the same in the UK, that people who ultimately would want to live but are just suffering, it's very easy and much cheaper for the state to simply say, well, let's put you out of your misery and kill you. It's much harder for the state and much more costly to say, let's help you. But that, I think, is what we should all agree the state should try and be doing for these people.
Absolutely. The state's there to serve us and represent us, not to destroy our lives, something which I think this government and the previous Tory government lost sight of. Okay, and tell me, what, for people who don't know, I know a little bit about what's happening in Canada. I mean, despite my experience and working in frontline child protection and child abuse and everything, I find this really upsetting. So I've not looked in too deeply at what's happening in Canada. But tell us.
Yeah, I mean, there's almost a story every day, and it's horrendous. And similar stories in the Netherlands, but we hear less about them, probably because of the language barrier. But Netherlands and Belgium have had just as horrific stories as Canada in the past. In the Netherlands, a couple of years ago, there was a woman who allegedly had said that she wanted to be euthanized. She had dementia, and then she decided when she had dementia that she wanted to stay alive. But the doctor said, well, you already agreed when you didn't have dementia to die, and so we're going to kill you. And so the woman, they had to forcibly restrain her. They had to get the family members to hold her down while they killed her because she had, previously agreed to this. And so that's one example from the Netherlands. What we see in all these countries, Netherlands, Canada, Belgium, etc., is a gradual increasing of the reasons or the category of people who are allowed to undergo this. So as I said, in the UK, what they've said is you have to have a 6-month diagnosis or prognosis that you're going to die in about 6 months or within that. But of course, this will never last as a safeguard because we have equality legislation that says you have to treat people equally. And also because of the inherent logic of euthanasia and assisted suicide, if it's fundamentally about autonomy or fundamentally about compassion, then none of these safeguards are actually justifiable. If you are the sole arbiter of when and how you die, and if we say that the only legitimate response to someone who is really, horribly suffering is to allow them to end their lives, then it is simply unjustifiable to say we're only going to limit this to a group of people that have 6 months left to live. If you really think that, easing suffering and autonomy are the most important things, then you should allow euthanasia to absolutely anyone who either says they want it or who is suffering, whether that suffering is for the next 3 months or 12 months or 10 years. And so what we've seen in those countries is that gradual expansion. So, initially it was physical conditions. You had to have cancer or a serious neurological condition or something like that. In Canada, the recent debate has been about increasing euthanasia to people with mental disorders. And that can be anorexia, can be ADHD. Some people, I think it was in Belgium, there was someone euthanized because they were gender dysphoric, they were transgender, and they didn't, they hated their body and their gender identity and so on. And they were so distressed by that the state agreed to kill them. There are many examples where this has just strayed into mental health conditions, people with autism. In Belgium, I think, again, there was a case where there was a criminal who had committed murder, I think, or rape, or I think probably both. So they couldn't undergo capital punishment because capital punishment was abolished in Belgium. But they could say, well, my life is so horrible because I've committed these murders and rapes and my mental status is not okay. And so I want the state to just euthanize me. And the state agreed to that in Belgium. And so what we see everywhere is this gradual expansion, which is absolutely inevitable. And we've seen that everywhere. But we also, the last kind of horror story I'll give from Canada is that the state, because of the financial incentives, they have a huge, huge incentive to push disabled and elderly people who require a lot of care towards euthanasia. And just one example, I met a woman last year who was I think she was a military veteran, and then she lost the use of her legs. She became a Paralympian, I think was one of Canada's most successful Paralympians ever. if I'm remembering the story correctly, it's something like this, but don't absolutely quote me on it. I think she was offered, or she said she needed a stair lift for her house. She couldn't get upstairs or anything like that, and she wanted to be able to do that. And essentially, she was told, "Well, we can't really afford to give you a stair lift, but have you considered euthanasia?" So it's absolutely, all of us, I think, can see what's wrong with that. But this is not an isolated case. There are many, many cases in Canada, especially, where people have been pressured into euthanasia by the healthcare providers, by the veteran services, even, basically because it's too expensive to keep them alive. And as we move towards an aging population, where the population is only going to get more old and disabled, and there are fewer taxpayers to look after them because we don't have enough kids in this country, it's even more inevitable that the state will see the economic pressure of elderly and disabled people. And at that point, even if it wasn't the intention of the people advocating for the bill, it doesn't matter what their intention is. Ultimately, the economic pressure will always kick in, and the state will always have an overwhelming incentive to just kill these people. And I think that's become obvious from other countries, and it will happen in the UK as well.
Yeah, well, it's also generally in history, governments slowly increase the powers that they have. That's the nature of bureaucracy. I'm in charge of your industry. Well, I'm going to keep on encroaching, taking more and more power for myself, justifying myself. Just have to look at how schools have evolved over the last 20, 30, 40 years, where they're doing more and more and more. A friend of mine contacted me because his local education authority was going to fine him because he took his kids out of school to take them on holiday. Well, wait a minute. Kids belong to the parents, not the school. The parents are responsible. But that sort of encroachment. And then there's the possibility for intrafamilial abuse. So I can easily imagine a situation where there's an elderly aunt or an uncle on their own, no kids, niece and nephew, or even if it's a mother or a father, and they've got this fat legacy inheritance that's going to go to the kids.
Mm-hmm.
And there's an incentive, especially if the relationship between the child or the children and their parents has broken down, through subtle pressure. And that's not something that the doctors are ever going to be able to examine or investigate. Do you want to speak to that?
Absolutely. Like I said, in Oregon, which is supposedly the place it's working well that we're copying from, according to the people pushing for the bill, 40% of people undergoing assisted suicide in Oregon say that one of their reasons is they felt that they were a burden on their friends and family. And so this is an overwhelming, common phenomenon. And all of us have seen abusive family members, whether in our own families or in other families. All of us can see that this kind of thing would exist, sadly. And did Oregons turn around and say, actually, if you're being pressured or you feel like a burden, then we're not going to euthanize you? No, they said, well, maybe that's a shame, but it's still your choice, and we're going to let you commit suicide, even if we know and you've told us that it's partly because you feel like a burden on your family. And so, I think absolutely this is a very significant worry, and it's something that we have to take very, very seriously. So I'm frightened about that. I'm frightened about the pressure that would be on those elderly people and parents who have looked after their kids, and their kids have a lot to gain from their deaths. And I think one of the things here is it doesn't even have to be kind of malicious, sort of abusive children or relatives that do this. Anyone who cares for an elderly grandparent or parent with a lot of care needs can find that really draining. I have family members who have who've basically had full-time jobs looking after elderly and frail relatives, and they love them with all their heart, and yet it was still extremely draining and a very difficult thing to go through. And I think even to open the door for situations like that, it doesn't even take a monster to be able to say, let's go ahead and just put you out of your misery. I think even well-intentioned, good people that really care could easily just feel like it's all too much, and the better thing is for the parent, the elderly relative, to just disappear in a sort of humane way, as they might put it. So I think it's a huge, huge worry.
Yes, absolutely. Now, I know that it's happened before, something similar, and I don't know if you know about this, but the Action 4 program by Hitler, where it was done in secret, but they started off euthanizing people with disabilities or undesirables, but who qualified just more and more people qualified for this program. And then there was so
Mhm.
much uproar from the church that, well, they started doing it in secret. So then I find it kind of upsetting that a so-called, well, an increasingly illiberal former democracy would take on a policy that Hitler had put in place. Are you familiar with Action 4?
Yeah, yeah, and you know, Hitler was obviously one of the most notorious sort of euthanasia programs. I think all of them are you know, become notorious over time because none of them work. But Hitler's was, of course, especially notorious because of its connection with everything else. You know, people might say, well, you know, Hitler did it involuntarily to disabled children who didn't agree to it. You know, to elderly people who didn't agree to it. And that's true, and that might be worse than some countries, but there are modern Western European countries that carry out involuntary euthanasia. So the Netherlands is probably the most notorious example. The Netherlands kills babies with disabilities under their euthanasia laws. The baby never consents. The baby, you know, they just determine that the baby is likely to suffer, usually because they got spina bifida or a condition like that. And the Netherlands, under the Groningen Protocol, just kills a lot of them. I think they've lowered it now,
Is that
but
without parental consent?
I don't know that. I assume it's probably with parental consent, but I don't know for certain.
Right.
But it's, you know, it's still infanticide, sort of
Yeah.
well beyond abortion. It's just killing the child. But also at the other end of life, you know, there are I think thousands and thousands of people in the Netherlands who are killed without their consent in the old age. I think often demented, but not always. And so the thought, and this makes sense if the reason for euthanasia is compassion. You know, if you want to say this person is just suffering unbearably, then what about if you have someone who can't make a decision for themselves, but you think they're suffering? Well, if you really think that unbearable suffering justifies euthanasia, and maybe your relative can't communicate because they've got a neurological condition or dementia or something, then it seems like you have to just euthanize them, but, you know, according to your own principles. And that's exactly what's happened in the Netherlands. There are thousands and thousands of people who are killed without their consent in the Netherlands under their euthanasia laws. And so in that sense, it doesn't even look that much different. I mean, Hitler's, I'm sure, was more sort of indiscriminate, and I'm sure there was sort of you know, it was racially targeted in many ways and so on. But there are ways that even the modern Western sort of liberal versions of euthanasia echo some of the worst features of Hitler's regime. And so it's frightening. I think, you know, in 1947, the British Medical Association came out with a statement after the Second World War, and they said that we have to reaffirm the Hippocratic Oath. And they said that the greatest crime is to cooperate in killing, either through murder or suicide. And so they were very clear in the wake of Hitler's program what the medical profession was about, that it forbade suicide and murder and killing for a doctor. And, you know, one of the doctors commenting on the Nuremberg trials, I think it was Leo Alexander, basically said something along the lines of, it was this infinitely small lever, the idea that you can take a human life. Once you cross that Rubicon, there is no going back, and it allows you all sorts of expansion into that thinking. The infinitely small lever is the idea that some lives are not worth living. And once you grant that principle that some lives are not worth living, then everything follows from that, including eugenics, including killing the elderly, killing babies, whatever it might be. And all of it derived from that basic idea that some lives are not worth living.
Okay. Sorry, I'm just getting upset listening to you about this, you know, because I'm up for a world where human beings honor human beings. We honor each and every single one of us, you know. Okay, so then for you as a doctor and for the doctors, you go into the medical profession because you want to make people well.
Mhm.
I mean, you're going to have to deal with, any doctor's going to have to deal with all sorts of, with themselves about this, but also what's the position of the GMC and the General Medical Council and the BMA and other doctors groups?
Yeah, I don't know if the GMC has taken a position. The BMA a couple of years ago they used to oppose this, and now they've adopted a stance of neutrality. So they still don't strictly oppose it, but they don't support it either. When you look at surveys of doctors, there's actually a very big variety depending on the discipline. And I think, you know, doctors on the whole are somewhat divided about it. But I think the most striking thing is that palliative care doctors are overwhelmingly against it. It's like 90% of palliative care doctors oppose this. And they are the ones who have the best understanding of suffering patients, patients at the end of their lives, the pressures on patients to end their lives, the interaction with the families. And they are the ones who are absolutely overwhelmingly opposed to this. I think it's interesting what you mentioned earlier about the doctors, whether they're able to evaluate patients for familial pressure and things like that. And I think that's also a very important practical point, that the NHS is already profoundly stretched. Doctors just do not have time to do their jobs. Mm-hmm. In many cases, they don't even have the time to do jobs adequately, and they put patients in danger just because they don't have enough time and staff. And to say that they're now going to have to do these assessments where they go all the way into a patient's history and their family and try to make non-medical judgments about family dynamics and things like that. It really is, it's crazy to think. And likewise with the lawyers and the judges. I think in the bill, there's a provision that says all of these has to go through a judge. And I think someone worked out this would be I think it would be hundreds of cases per judge every year. There's just not enough judges to actually do that. And that's why, you had a similar system in the Netherlands where they said, this has to be really rigorous. The doctor has to look into it. It has to be approved by a committee. When you look at it in practice, the committee just signed anything. Even when there were sort of allegations of murder, the committee usually just sort of waved it away and dismissed it and said, it's probably fine. When you look at the way this has actually tried to be regulated, and when doctors have tried to be part of the procedure to really determine whether this is a good idea, it's never worked because doctors and judges and committees just do not have the time. And they will always just end up having to say, I'm sure it's fine, and just wave it through, which eradicates all the safeguards completely.
Yeah, and they're always going to be acting in their own self-interest, protecting themselves and covering their arse. And if there's any mistakes or whatever, well, one, it's irreversible, too late, too bad, and it wasn't our fault. That's always
there. Sorry.
Go on, Colin.
I was just going to say, doctors always have doctors are a guild, and they unionize and they sort of band together just as any other profession does. And their vested interests will always be on, in terms of preserving their legal sort of safety. And so what we see with these things where we give doctors more power and sort of less oversight is very often that they sort of agree to this and they push for this just because it makes them all less likely to get sued and get in trouble eventually. Now, that's not to say that every regulation is good. I actually think doctors in some ways are over-regulated and there's too much oversight and sort of micromanagement. But I think when it comes to monumental issues like this, I think it's a clear case where doctors' vested interests are going to be in protecting themselves, which overwhelmingly is going to be sort of making the law more liberal and lax, so that if it is abused, they're on the safe side of it. So that's another danger as well.
Yeah. Now, I understand there are provisions in the bill, which is going through Parliament now, that would allow the Minister of Health or the Minister of Assisted Suicide to then make changes about who can make a determination and who qualifies. Have I understood that? Who qualifies for this process and who can ultimately decide? Have I understood this correctly?
It's a good question. I don't remember the exact provisions of that part, but it's certainly a very common phenomenon that the sort of regulation is often sort of postponed to something with much less oversight. The idea is that you make these big decisions in Parliament where everyone scrutinizes it, and then later, the minister is given some powers to sort of tweak the details. But what we were told is that this is the safest bill with the strongest safeguards anywhere in the world. And huge scrutiny on this bill. And yet this is a bill that was released just a couple of weeks before the vote. It's a bill that I think they allowed 5 hours for debate, and then we decide whether or not doctors are now allowed to kill or not. It's a bill where the sponsor has essentially said in many ways, in many different contexts, supposedly, yes, the safeguards are really strong now, but ultimately, if you're in doubt about the bill, just pass it and then we will fix it later, which is a scandalously sort of reckless and horrifying approach to legislation of this sort of scope and seriousness. And so, I think in many ways there is a lack of scrutiny about this bill, and I'm sure a large part of that is the way that it gives a lot of discretion and powers essentially in future to the executive and to the minister rather than to Parliament, which really should be scrutinizing a bill of this gravity.
Yeah, and also rather taking it out of the hands of the person concerned and their family members, who really should have a say, and not like, yes, please suicide this one, not like that, but it's not the province of bureaucrats, in my opinion. Now, I want to say a few things, Callum, that you may or may not be aware of. If you are, forgive me, but this is for the general viewers, right? So one of the things I do as a social worker, there's all the stuff that you see on the surface, the justifications that an abuser might use to cover up and mask what they're doing. That this is really good for the child or whatever. I'm doing it for his or her best interest and stuff. And it's a complete it's a grooming mechanism. Abusers will groom the child and they'll groom the people around the child so they can carry on with their perfidy. Now, as a scientist, I imagine you're familiar with fractals, with self-repeating patterns on different scales, and human behavior is on different. It also shows up in fractals. So if you were the Minister for Health, I imagine the stand that you have, the belief that you have, the attitude that you have with regards to this issue would just to get to play out on a larger scale. You'd be in Parliament saying, no, I oppose this. Just the same pattern, larger scale. And then one of the things I do as a social worker is I look at something from many, many different angles. What's the school saying? What's the health visitor saying? What's the GP saying? What's the mum saying? What's the dad saying? What are the different children saying? What are the teachers saying? What's the school nurse saying? Lots and lots of different angles. So then if I look at the policies that this government has been putting in place, and I include the Tory government as well since 2019, since 2020, really since lockdown began. And I don't know your position or views on that whole episode. Just to make it clear, I did not have those injections, thank bloody goodness. I'm so grateful. Neither did my wife or my children or my sister who live with us, right? I have no regrets whatsoever. There was no way I was going to have them. But what we were told at the time, and by the way, I'm bringing this back to the assisted suicide bill, is, one of the things during lockdown is stay at home. I'll let you know when you can go out. I'll let you know what you have to wear. I'll tell you where you can go and who you can mix with. Don't worry about an independent income. I'll give you some money. And this is all for your own good. Well, that's what perpetrators of domestic abuse say to their partners. And it's the same conversation, but the government are now doing this. So this government is attacking our food security by destroying small family farms. It's a land grab like Stalin did, in my opinion. This government is sending money to further the slaughter of people in Ukraine and Israel and dropping bombs on people in Yemen, at the same time denying the elderly money for heating. This government say they care about us and they want to reduce drinking hours. That's one of their proposals. Make it harder, destroy pubs, destroy the social fabric of this country. This government is for a while now pushing the trans agenda for children. It's one thing for adults, but for children, which in my opinion, this is just Munchausen syndrome by proxy in a much larger scale. The sexualization of children, the material that's coming through schools, what else are they doing? The injections. The swine flu was withdrawn after 51 deaths in the United States. This particular injection, they just keep recommending to people, even though there are safe alternatives. And in the background, we're out of money. We're out of money. The UK government borrowed millions and millions and millions from bondholders to finance the Ukraine war, with the hope that somehow Ukraine would prevail over Russia, where Hitler's 3 million troops didn't. And then the UK can plunder Russia's rich resources and then pay back the bondholders. We don't have enough to pay for our pensions. We don't make anything anymore. We have riches in the form of oil and gas and coal, but we're not going to dig those out because carbon dioxide is dangerous, although it's actually plant food. Now, I'm not asking you for your opinion in all of this, right? Because you and I haven't covered these issues. But I'm just saying this is where I stand about it and where I see this fits in. This is another assault on the citizenry by this government. They're going to censor our speech. You can't object to immigration. I'm an immigrant, by the way. I wasn't born here. But you can't object to that. Where pedophiles get off. Was that Hugh Edwards? Nothing. 30 words, 2 years. Right? This is not a government that cares for us. So this is consistent with that. And the other thing that I think this is also consistent with is the assault on British culture and Christian values. And I speak as a Muslim. When you destroy the culture of a society, you destroy the religion that ties it together, people become easier to rule over. Because what do we anchor ourselves by? So it's all down to the money. We're out of money, so the government want to kill us off, and they're making it all sound very humane and just and considered. Any comments that you want to make about this?
There's a lot there, but I agree, of course, that the government, and I don't just mean the new Labour government, the previous Conservative government have trampled over civil liberties and just made a mockery of liberal democracy. I don't think there's any particularly good party. I think the Conservative Party is particularly bad. The Labour Party is obviously awful. Even Reform, you hope that they could offer something different, but their deputy chair, Richard Tice, came out in support of this euthanasia law, which to me was a huge disappointment. And I think shows that we have a long way to go in terms of getting a political party that is just solidly for common sense. I hope that Reform can still sort of get back to that. Maybe it's just a small blip in the road, but it is concerning. And so, yeah, I think there's huge difficulties with the way we're governed, with the trampling on civil liberties. And ultimately, as you say, a lot of it is economic. I wish I could remember the quote. I can't remember the quote, but I think it was, who was it? I think it was Jacques Attali, prominent kind of European statesman, very kind of prominent in European politics in the last century. And he said something along the lines of, at some point we're just going to have to euthanize people for economic reasons. I wish I could look up the quote. Maybe I'll send it to you and you can add it on.
I have seen that somewhere. I have seen that. It's in a book.
Right.
Something. Yes.
And it's at times it has been completely transparent. Obviously, it's not in general. And again, as I said earlier, we shouldn't sort of tarnish every supporter of this bill with sort of economic motivations. But it almost doesn't matter what the sponsors of the bill intend. They might be the most well-intentioned people in the world, and I'm sure some of them are. What matters is what is actually going to happen in practice. And what is going to happen in practice is that the economics is going to take over. Old and disabled people are going to become a burden, and they're going to be killed en masse. And that is just the inevitable reality in 10 or 20 or 30 years as our economy declines and as our population ages even more than it has done already.
Yes, and I think it's a dangerous precedent. It's a slippery slope. It's a dangerous change in the conversation. Okay, so what can we do?
Good question. Well, there's only a few days, I think just over a week until the vote. And, there will be another vote after this, but this is really the key one where they will decide on the whole, is this bill going to progress and are we going to legalize assisted suicide or euthanasia? I think the most important thing, therefore, is for people to write to their MPs, write to, if they're parties, if they're a member of a party, just make it absolutely clear and say that your vote will be affected on the basis of this. Write to your MPs. There are many organizations that can make that easy for you online. And that's, as I say, there are problems in every political party on this issue in the UK. And so all of them are worth writing to. What we've seen that's more positive is that even among the sort of Labour, which is a pretty far left government, we've seen significant opposition from Wes Streeting, the health secretary, and other prominent figures. I think the deputy prime minister said she's going to vote against it. So we do have a chance of stopping this. This is far from a foregone conclusion, but people absolutely need to write to their MPs to make a fuss about this. If you're a healthcare professional, make your voice heard. If you're someone with a particular set of skills, reach out to the campaign groups to see if you can help. There are a number of great groups working on this. And so, yeah, just go onto Google, look them up and see how you can support, because there's only about a week left to do this.
Okay. All right, Callum, listen, thank you so much. There's something I'm going to add. And I'm going to give you a disclaimer. I'm going to state a disclaimer for you. So this is not being endorsed by Dr. Callum Miller, right? This is me. Okay, I'm saying this. So and I've been promoting this on my channel for a while, is that you can engage in lawful tax revolt. International Criminal Court Act and the Terrorism Act make it a criminal offense to give any money to any agency that's engaging in genocide, war crimes, crimes against humanity, and acts of terrorism, or facilitating or funding those activities. And the Supreme Court and those statutes make it clear that the UK government and its agencies, including HMRC, are not exempt from those provisions. And if people want to find out, bit.ly/lawful tax protest. bit.ly/lawful tax protest. So that's another way that we can make our voices known. Even if you support the war in Ukraine and the war in Gaza and what's happening in Yemen, but you oppose what's happening with this, that the government should sanction the murder, the suicide of British citizens who are in poor health, you can protest by legally withholding your taxes. So, and again, this is not endorsed by Dr. Callum Miller. He didn't know I was going to say this either.
No comment whatsoever.
No comment whatsoever. And you'll find out by going to that website. Callum, thank you so much. I so appreciate you coming on. And if you're willing to, I'd love to have you back on again. If you want to follow the progress of this, please give me the links to some of those organizations. I'll put them in the description below. And everybody, please share this video. We've got to do what we can to fight this and all the other malign, disempowering pieces of legislation that are coming our way. This is Callum and Rich signing out. All the best. Bye-bye.